The Moral Ruin of Rome, an exploration of Augustine's City of God, Book 2. In Book 2 of Augustine's City of God, he discusses the gradual moral collapse of Rome. He writes, "For in the ruin of the city it was stone and timber which fell to the ground. But in the lives of those Romans, we saw the collapse not of material, but of moral defenses, not of material, but of spiritual grandeur." He further writes, "The lust that burned in their hearts was more deadly than the flame which consumed their dwellings." So in the context of the collapse of Rome at the hands of Alaric the Visigoth in 410 AD, we have what Augustine focuses on as the moral destruction of Rome that had led up to that destruction, that great material socio-political destruction. The main assertion the pagans were making, and which occasioned the writing of the City of God, was the charge that the Roman pagan gods were punishing Rome for having abandoned them for the worship of Christianity, the Christian God. Now, Augustine puts this question to the Romans themselves, the Roman pagans. He says, "Why then did the gods, that is, the pagan gods, allow the catastrophes which I am going to mention to fall upon their worshippers before the proclamation of Christ's name offended them, and before Christ's name put a stop to their sacrifices?" In other words, he's going to discuss the calamities that befell Rome long before the preaching of the gospel. Augustine discusses the calamities that befell pagan Rome under three headings: morality, religion, and entertainment. First, we'll look at morality. He wants to know why the Roman gods didn't promote morality among the Roman people themselves. The idea being that morality is what maintains peace and order in any commonwealth, in any political order whatsoever. Augustine asks, in the first place, why did these gods refuse to take the trouble to prevent the degeneration of morality? Why did they give their worshippers no laws to help them to a good way of life? It would certainly have been fitting for the gods to be concerned about the conduct of those who concerned themselves with their worship. So in other words, we have supposed gods that do not instruct the people who worship them in any kind of moral conduct necessary for the preservation of civic life. Augustine then discusses Roman religion and its own moral depravity. He focuses particularly on the cult of what he calls the Mother of the Gods. Now, this, of course, is not Mary, the Mother of God, but one Berecynthia, a goddess derived from West Syria and Carthage. He writes, on the yearly festival of Berecynthia's purification, the lowest kind of actors sang, in front of her litter, songs unfit for the ears of even the mother of one of those mountebanks, to say nothing of any decent citizen or of a senator. And certainly those very mountebanks, and by the way, a mountebank is basically any type of fraud, like a mountebank monk, a mountebank doctor, a mountebank preacher, and so on. And certainly those very mountebanks, those frauds, would be ashamed to give a rehearsal performance in their homes before their mothers of those disgusting verbal and acted obscenities. He further writes or asks, if these were sacred rites, what is meant by sacrilege? If this is purification, what is meant by pollution? And he doesn't really go into detail as to what exactly these religious rites were, but we can take him at his word that these religious rites were obscene on some level. And so Augustine asks, who could fail to recognize what kind of spirits they are, which could enjoy such obscenities? And finally, Augustine goes on to discuss popular entertainment, particularly the theater. We see immorality in Roman society as a whole. We see immorality expressed in religious rites, but even more insidiously, we see it represented or portrayed in Roman entertainment and in the theater, where it affects the popular imagination, much like entertainment affects the popular imagination of any society today. Now, Augustine, in reference to the theater, he writes, those shows in which the fictions of the poets hold sway were introduced by the Romans into the worship of their gods, not through ignorant following of the poet's teaching, but because the gods themselves sternly commanded, indeed almost extorted, the production of such shows, demanding that they should be consecrated in their honor. So not only do the gods demand obscene religious rites, but they demand obscene theater shows, theatrical shows. Augustine further says the theatrical shows were first instituted at Rome by the authority of the pontiffs at a time when plague was raging. Now, the pontiffs here are not, of course, the Roman pontiff of today, the Holy Father, the Pope, but the priests of the Roman state religion. They had the title of pontiff. And so he concludes, rather, therefore any man will surely think that in the way he lives his life ought to follow the example set by what is acted in plays instituted by divine authority rather than by what is written in laws laid down by mere human wisdom. In other words, a people can be instructed by the laws that they enact, or they can be instructed by popular entertainment. And it is unfortunately popular entertainment that is actually more influential and instructive for people, generally speaking. So any laws that the Romans implemented or enacted to promote public morality would be overridden by the immorality they were learning in their religion and in their entertainment, particularly their theatrical shows. A further point Augustine makes in regard to the immorality of the theater was the status that the theater actors held in Roman society. And he underscores this by contrasting it with the same status the actors enjoyed in ancient Greece. Now, the Greeks actually honored their actors, kind of like we do today in Western culture. Augustine writes, it is another mark of consistency in the Greeks that they regarded even the actors of those stories, again, these licentious stories, these obscene stories, as worthy of considerable honor in the commonwealth. He further writes, since they regarded these accomplishments and those theatrical shows as acceptable even to their gods, they thought it would be inappropriate to class the actors among outlaws and vagabonds. So he commends the consistency of the Greeks in that they honored the actors who performed these obscene acts in honor of the gods. They didn't dishonor them. The Romans, however, were inconsistent. But it does show their own, in an odd way, their own sense of public decency. Their inconsistency does. Augustine writes, although the Romans were at this time so much under the sway of baneful superstition that they worshipped gods whom they thought of as wishing to have theatrical obscenities devoted to their honor, they still had enough concern for their own dignity and modesty to refrain from honoring the actors of such fables in the manner of the Greeks. He further writes, in fact, as Scipio says in Cicero's book, his book on the Commonwealth or the Republic, quote, they had such a low opinion of the theater and of the acting profession that they, the Romans, decided not only to debar actors from normal political life, but even to remove their names from the tribal lists through the intervention of the censors. So while the Greeks honored actors, the Romans censored them, kept them out of public life because of the immorality they're promoting in their stage shows. And so while he points out their inconsistency when compared to the Greeks, Augustine does commend the Romans for their basic sense of decency. He writes, here was the genuine Roman spirit, the spirit of community, jealous for its honor. But I want an answer to this question, he continues. How can it be consistent to deprive theatrical performers of any political standing, and at the same time to admit theatrical performances as an ingredient in divine worship? So if the theatrical performances are so immoral, why are they being portrayed in the religious rites? Why are they finding their way in the offerings they make to their gods? Doesn't this speak something about the character of the gods themselves asks Augustine. And then he gives us a syllogism to drive home his point. Augustine writes, in this argument, the conclusion is reached by the following line of reasoning. The Greek proposition is, if such gods are to be worshipped, it follows that such men are to be honored. The Romans put the minor premise, but such men are in no way to be honored. The Christians draw the conclusion, therefore such gods are in no way to be worshipped. In a very orderly, systematic way, Augustine points out the inconsistency of the Romans in worshiping gods whose character was reflected in actors they refused to honor and barred from public life. Augustine then draws his conclusion. He writes, thus, though corrupt thoughts, corrupt lives, and corrupt conduct are so dangerous that their most learned men assert that countries come to ruin through them, even when cities still stand, nevertheless, their gods were not in the least concerned to protect their worshippers from such disasters. In fact, as we have argued, they were most concerned to promote this corruption. So the assumption of Augustine, and I think it's a sound assumption, is that immorality, public immorality, along with private immorality, leads to the ruin of any kind of political order. The Romans themselves agreed to this, and they prohibit public honors and public participation to actors and those who act out licentious, immoral actions and plays. So the Romans themselves acknowledge that immorality is destructive to the commonwealth. And yet their only god, the gods, the very gods they worship, promoted such immorality. So really, as Augustine is arguing, it is truly these gods who were in fact demons in Augustine's mind. These so-called gods were the ones responsible for Rome's moral demise and ultimately her political collapse, not Christianity.